Florida's sunlight has a way of making everything look brighter than it really is. The palms sway, the ocean breeze carries promises, and the little towns scattered along the Gulf look like postcards. But behind the picket fences and brick courthouses, secrets take root. Secrets no sunshine can burn away. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell embodied the face of order in one of those towns. In his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a jaw that still looked chiseled from his younger days, he had worn the badge for nearly 2 decades. People trusted him. They waved when he passed by in his tan patrol truck. Mothers told their kids, "If you're ever in trouble, find Sheriff Caldwell." He was, to most, a symbol of protection. But symbols are just masks, and Caldwell wore his better than anyone. Underneath the polished uniform and Sunday handshakes was a man growing tired. Tired of being perfect. Tired of pretending he didn't crave more than the respect of his neighbors. He drank too much sweet tea on his porch at dusk and stared across his manicured lawn, wondering if this was all life had to offer. The uniform gave him power, but power, when not enough, curdles into temptation. And that temptation found a name, Yvonne Harris. Yvonne wasn't a girl anymore, though Caldwell first noticed her because of her youthful energy. She was 31, with a kind of beauty that carried both softness and sorrow. Her life hadn't been easy. 2 failed relationships, a string of jobs that barely paid rent, and a heart that still wanted to believe love wasn't just a story people told themselves to feel less alone. She lived in a small rental duplex with faded yellow paint, where the neighbors argued loud enough to shake the walls. But her dreams went beyond all that. Yvonne wanted to feel chosen, wanted to feel safe, wanted to matter to someone who mattered. The night their paths crossed was so ordinary, no one could predict how it would spiral. It was a town meeting held in the community center with its squeaky folding chairs and the smell of overbrewed coffee. Caldwell was speaking about neighborhood watch programs, rattling off statistics that barely held anyone's attention. Yvonne sat in the back row, bored until her eyes locked with his. For a second, she felt like he saw straight through her. Not the tired waitress, not the woman who counted pennies at the grocery store, but someone worth noticing. And he didn't look away. After the meeting, as the crowd trickled out, Caldwell approached her with that calm authority that made people listen before he even spoke. "You look like you had something on your mind back there," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Yvonne gave a small laugh, more nervous than amused. "Just wondering if all those numbers mean anything to folks like me. We still go home to the same locks, the same fears." Caldwell studied her for a moment, then said, "You deserve someone who sees you, Yvonne. Someone who knows your worth." It was bold, too bold for a man in uniform. But boldness, wrapped in confidence, can feel like gravity. She tilted her head, almost daring him. "And that someone is the sheriff of this whole town?" A half-smile flickered across his lips. "Maybe it is." The moment hung heavy, electric. For Yvonne, it felt like a door opening, a door she'd been waiting for. For Caldwell, it felt like crossing a line, and once crossed, there was no going back. That night, Yvonne replayed the conversation in her mind as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across her walls. A part of her warned, "Don't do this. Don't get involved with him." But another voice, louder and harder to ignore, whispered, "He's the sheriff. He could give you the life you've always wanted." For Caldwell, sitting on his porch with a glass of whiskey instead of tea, he thought about her laugh, her eyes, the way she didn't flinch under his stare. He told himself it would just be one conversation, nothing more. Yet deep down he knew better. He'd taken his first step onto a road that ended in darkness. What neither of them could see that night was how far that darkness would stretch, or how it would swallow them both. By the time summer rolled in, what began as a stolen glance at a town meeting had grown into something far more dangerous. Thomas Caldwell and Yvonne Harris became a secret fire, burning in the shadows of Florida nights, hidden behind locked motel doors, and whispered over burner phones that never left a trace. The first time it happened, Yvonne swore it would be the last. She told herself it was a slip, a mistake driven by loneliness. But the way Caldwell looked at her, like she wasn't invisible, like she was worth more than the world had ever told her, made it impossible to stop. And when he pressed his callous hand over hers, Steady and firm, she didn't think about rules, vows, or the risk of scandal. She thought only of how alive she felt. Caldwell, for his part, found himself addicted to her presence. By day, he was a sheriff in his tan uniform, shaking hands, breaking up bar fights, playing the part of a respectable man. By night, he stripped that skin away, becoming someone reckless, someone free. Every time he left her apartment or the roadside cabin they rented by the hour, he told himself it was the last time. And yet, he always came back. Their meetings became a pattern. Sometimes it was a cheap motel with flickering neon signs, where the hum of an air conditioner drowned out their laughter. Other times, it was in Caldwell's county-issued SUV, parked deep in the woods where no deputy dared to patrol. There was passion, yes, but there was also danger, an edge that made every kiss taste sharper. Yvonne's heart swelled with the thrill of it. She was wanted by the man who held power over the whole town. He wasn't just anyone. He was the one people turned to when chaos struck. And now he turned to her. Still, doubt crept in when the night faded, and she lay alone in her bed. She thought of the whispers that would ripple through the town if anyone found out. She thought of Caldwell's wife, who played the perfect hostess at church socials. And yet, when her phone buzzed with his name, she always answered. One evening, as they lay tangled in the sheets of a rented room, Yvonne broke the silence. "What if someone finds out?" she asked, her voice a mixture of fear and longing. Caldwell rolled over, propping himself up on one elbow. His gaze was steady, cold in its certainty. "They won't," he said. "This town trusts me more than God himself." The word sent a shiver through her, not just from the confidence, but from the truth in it. Caldwell was untouchable. And if he was untouchable, then so was she, or so she thought. In public, their lives carried on as if nothing had changed. Yvonne waited tables at a diner off the highway, pouring coffee for truckers and retirees, smiling politely while her mind replayed their nights together. Caldwell patrolled the streets, tipped his hat at the mayor, and gave safety lectures at the local school. But beneath it all, there was a current, a pull that drew them back together again and again. The fifth time they met, Yvonne told herself she was falling for him. She wanted to believe it wasn't just lust, wasn't just a thrill of sneaking around. She wanted it to mean something. That night, she pressed him for answers. "Tell me I'm not just another secret," she whispered against his chest. Caldwell hesitated. Then he kissed her forehead, murmuring, "You're the only one who makes me forget the rest of the world." It was enough to keep her hooked, though somewhere deep inside, a seed of doubt remained. The world outside their bubble carried on, but cracks were forming. Yvonne began to notice things. Bruises on her skin that lingered longer than they should, headaches that pounded after their nights together. Caldwell, meanwhile, grew more reckless, texting her while sitting in his patrol truck, calling her after midnight as if daring the universe to expose him. And yet, neither of them could stop. The sheriff with everything to lose, the woman with everything to prove. Together, they had lit a fire. But even fires that burn brightest eventually consume everything around them. At first, Yvonne believed she had found her escape. Every stolen night felt like a promise that life could be bigger than rent checks and broken dreams. But as the weeks passed, the shimmer began to dull, replaced by a heaviness she couldn't ignore. Her body was the first to betray her. The headaches came in waves, pounding at her temples as if warning her to stop. Some mornings she woke with her stomach twisted in knots, too weak to eat. And then there were the bruises, marks left not by accident, but by Caldwell's roughness. What had once felt thrilling now carried an edge of cruelty, as if he was testing how much she could endure. Yvonne brushed it aside at first. She told herself love wasn't supposed to be easy, that maybe passion always left scars. But late at night, staring at the ceiling in her quiet duplex, unease gnawed at her. Something was wrong. Caldwell, meanwhile, seemed to grow bolder. His calls came at riskier hours. His touch was more demanding, his presence more controlling. He no longer asked if she was ready. He simply took. When she tried to question him, his answers carried a weight that made her stomach sink. One evening, after a meeting in the woods, Yvonne couldn't hold back anymore. She sat in the passenger seat of his SUV, her arms crossed tightly as the engine idled. Am I just another secret to you? She asked, her voice trembling. Caldwell's hand stayed fixed on the wheel. He exhaled slowly, then chuckled in that cold way that always made her feel small. Secrets keep the world spinning, darling, he said without looking at her. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. His words hit her harder than a slap. For the first time, she saw the man not as a protector, but as a stranger, someone who wielded power not just in the streets of their town, but in the shadows of her own life. The next morning at the diner, Yvonne poured coffee for a table of retirees, their laughter filling the air, but she could barely focus. Her mind replayed his words over and over, each repetition scraping at her like glass. She caught her reflection in the coffee pot, dark circles under her eyes, her skin pale. She looked like someone unraveling. And the whispers in town didn't help. Rumors spread like wildfire in small places, and though no one said Caldwell's name aloud, Yvonne heard fragments. A woman at the grocery store muttering about the sheriff's wandering eye. A drunk at the diner claiming Caldwell had ruined more than one marriage. Each whisper lodged in Yvonne's chest until it was hard to breathe. That night, she confronted him again. They stood in the dim light of her duplex living room, the blinds drawn tight. I hear things, Thomas, she said, her arms wrapped around herself. You've done this before, haven't you? I'm not the first. Caldwell's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He stepped closer, the smell of whiskey sharp on his breath. You think you know me? He hissed. You don't know a damn thing. You're here because you wanted this as much as I did. Yvonne's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to push him out, but her legs wouldn't move. His presence filled the room like smoke, suffocating and heavy. After he left, slamming the door behind him, Yvonne collapsed onto the couch. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered into the empty room. What have I done? But even in her grief, she couldn't let go. The sheriff was like gravity, dark, relentless, impossible to escape. And part of her, no matter how much she hated herself for it, still craved the way he made her feel chosen. Weeks blurred together, and the cracks in their fantasy deepened. Yvonne's health worsened, her unease growing with every encounter. Caldwell became more unpredictable, sometimes tender, sometimes cruel, always leaving her more broken than before. She had entered this affair believing it would make her stronger, believing it would finally give her the life she wanted. Instead, it was hollowing her out piece by piece. And though she couldn't see it yet, the darkness that had crept into her life was only beginning to reveal itself. The 10th night was supposed to feel like all the others, secret, electric, and dangerous. But from the moment Yvonne opened the door to her duplex, she sensed something was off. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell stood there with a half-empty bottle of bourbon in his hand, his uniform shirt untucked, eyes bloodshot. He didn't greet her with a smile. He pushed past her into the living room, heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. Yvonne froze in the doorway, clutching the hem of her dress. Something in his energy felt wrong. Darker, colder. Thomas, she said softly, almost afraid to break the silence. Maybe tonight isn't a good idea. He turned to her, that crooked smile stretching across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Don't start, he muttered, his voice thick with liquor. You wanted this. Remember? Yvonne's heart raced. She wanted to tell him no, to send him away, but the same pull that had brought her to him again and again weakened her resolve, against her better judgment. She followed him into the bedroom. What happened that night blurred the line between passion and violence. Caldwell was rough, more than he'd ever been. He didn't whisper promises, didn't murmur her name with affection. His touch was hard, careless, almost cruel. And Yvonne, caught between fear and longing, let it happen, though tears pricked the corners of her eyes. When it was over, she lay trembling in the darkness, her body aching. Caldwell rolled onto his back, already reaching for the bourbon on the nightstand. The air smelled of sweat, alcohol, and something else. Something faint, sour, that made Yvonne's stomach turn. She drifted into a restless sleep, praying she'd wake to find this was just another secret night she could tuck away. But the morning brought no comfort. At first, it was just pain, a sharp, stabbing ache low in her abdomen. She sat up, clutching herself, gasping for air. Caldwell was already dressing, buttoning his shirt with hands that shook slightly. He didn't look at her. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't feel right." "Drink some water," he muttered, pulling on his boots. But then the pain deepened, spreading like fire through her body. Panic clawed at her chest. She stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the doorway as a wave of nausea hit. And that was when she saw it, when the nightmare began. In the pale morning light, she caught sight of movement where no movement should be. Tiny, pale forms writhing, crawling. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred as she realized what she was seeing. Maggots, crawling from inside her. A scream tore from her throat, high and raw, echoing against the bathroom walls. "Oh, God, no. No, no, no." She collapsed to the floor, clutching herself, shaking violently. Tears streamed down her face as horror consumed her. This wasn't sickness. This was rot, alive and merciless, eating her from within. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought she saw a guilt flicker across his face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Thomas," she sobbed, reaching out to him. "What's happening to me? Please help me." He stood there, silent, his jaw tight. Then, with chilling calm, he said, "Don't call me. Don't you ever call me again." Yvonne stared at him in disbelief, her hand still outstretched. "You knew," she whispered through sobs. "You knew something was wrong with you." But he didn't answer. He turned, walked out of the bathroom, and a moment later she heard the front door slam shut. The sound of his boots on the gravel outside was the last thing she remembered before darkness swarmed her vision. When she came to, the bathroom floor was cold against her skin, her body still racked with pain. She dragged herself up, trembling, and stumbled to the sink. Her reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, her eyes wide and wild. "Get together, Yvonne," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "Don't let this kill you." But deep down, she knew her life had changed forever. The man she had trusted, the man she had craved, had left her marked with something far worse than heartbreak. He had left her with decay, crawling and alive, a horror that would haunt her until her last breath. The fantasy was dead. What remained was a nightmare, one she could never escape. Yvonne staggered into the emergency room just after sunrise, clutching her stomach, her face pale and drenched with sweat. The nurses at the front desk froze as they took in her wild eyes and trembling hands. She didn't look like a woman with a fever or a simple infection. She looked like someone fleeing death itself. "Please," she gasped, gripping the counter with shaking fingers. "Something's wrong. Something's crawling inside me." The triage nurse blinked, her professional calm faltering for just a second before she nodded to two orderlies. "Get her back. Now." Within minutes, Yvonne was rushed into a sterile room, the sharp smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils. A doctor in blue scrubs, Dr. Patel, entered quickly, snapping on gloves. Yvonne's body shook with sobs as she tried to explain through broken breaths. "They're inside me. I swear to God, I saw them, maggots." The room went still. The nurse exchanged a look with the doctor, a look that carried both disbelief and dread. But when Dr. Patel performed the examination, the silence was shattered. He pulled back, his eyes widening. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. "Give me a surgical kit now." Yvonne saw the horror in his face and knew she wasn't insane. Her screams, her fear, they were real. Something had been festering inside her, something Caldwell had left behind like a curse. As the medical team worked frantically, Yvonne clutched the sheet in her fists, tears soaking the fabric. Her mind spun in flashes, his touch, his silence, the sour smell on his skin, the way he walked out as if she were nothing. Rage mingled with terror until she could hardly tell the difference. Hours later, after the worst of the infestation was cleared and Yvonne was stabilized, the doctor returned. His face was grave. He pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Yvonne," he said gently, "we found evidence of severe bacterial infection. What you described, it was real. The infestation was likely secondary, meaning your body had already been compromised for some time." She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "What does that mean?" "It means someone passed this to you," he said carefully. "An advanced, untreated infection. If it had gone unnoticed much longer, it could have killed you." The words hit her like a blow. She turned her face to the wall, her chest heaving. She didn't need to ask who had passed it. She already knew. When the nurse left the room, Yvonne grabbed her phone from the bedside table, her hands shaking as she dialed. Caldwell's number went straight to voicemail. Her chest tightened with fury. He had left her to rot while he walked free in his polished uniform, shaking hands and smiling for cameras. By evening, a detective arrived. Detective Maria Lopez, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority. She sat at Yvonne's bedside, notebook in hand. "Ms. Harris," Lopez said, her tone steady but not unkind. "The doctors told us what they found. We need to know who you've been with. Anyone who could have passed this to you." Yvonne hesitated. Her instinct was to stay quiet. The sheriff had warned her, threatened her without words. But then she remembered his cold voice in the bathroom. "Don't call me. Don't you ever call me again." He had abandoned her, discarded her like trash. Her jaw tightened. "It was Sheriff Caldwell," she whispered. "Thomas Caldwell. He knew something was wrong with him. He knew and he didn't care." Detective Lopez's pen froze over her notepad. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned closer. "Are you absolutely certain?" Yvonne's eyes burned with tears. "I'd stake my life on it. He's the only one." Lopez exhaled slowly, her gaze hardening. She knew what this meant. A case against a sheriff wasn't just about evidence. It was about tearing down the man who embodied the law in the eyes of the community. But the evidence was already screaming louder than politics. After the detective left, Yvonne lay awake in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Every sound of the monitors beeped like a countdown. Her life had split into a before and after, and there was no going back. She had once believed Caldwell was her savior. Now she knew he was her destroyer. And if the town refused to see it, then she would make them. With every breath, her resolve grew sharper. She wouldn't die as victim. She would live as his accuser. And though the sheriff still walked the streets with his badge pinned to his chest, Yvonne had something he could never control anymore: the truth. The first article appeared 3 days after Yvonne's confession. It was short, buried halfway down the front page of the Gulf Coast Tribune, but its headline struck like a lightning bolt. "Sheriff under investigation for alleged misconduct." At first, the words were vague, phrases like possible health violations, endangering community members, and accusations of abuse of power. But those who knew how to read between the lines sensed something more sinister. Within hours, the whisper started. At gas stations, in church pews, on porches across the county, people spoke the same name with equal parts shock and suspicion: Sheriff Thomas Caldwell. Caldwell himself tried to brush it off. At the morning press briefing, he stood at the podium in his crisp uniform, voice steady, eyes locked on the crowd. "These rumors are baseless," he declared, his jaw tight. "I've served this county for 20 years with honor. I will not be distracted by slander." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked, and behind the polished words, one truth became undeniable. Caldwell looked rattled. His voice carried a defensive edge. His mask was beginning to slip. Back at the hospital, Yvonne watched the press conference from her bed. The sight of him, standing so tall and smug, while she lay weak and bandaged, made her blood boil. She grabbed a remote and hurled it across the room, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Honor," she spat at the screen. "You call this honor?" Detective Maria Lopez visited later that afternoon, her notebook thicker now, her face harder. She sat beside Yvonne and leaned forward. "You started a fire," Lopez said plainly, "and it's spreading fast." Yvonne swallowed. "Good. Let it burn him down." The detective nodded, but her voice carried caution. "Understand, this won't be easy. He's not just a man. He's a sheriff. People will defend him. Some will even hate you for speaking out." "I don't care," Yvonne said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He left me to die. If I stay silent, he'll do it to someone else." That resolve gave Lopez the fuel she needed. Over the next week, she and her team dug deeper. Medical records confirmed Yvonne's infection had been advanced, untreated for months. Text messages between her and Caldwell revealed not just the affair, but his chilling disregard, and whispers from other women, some anonymous, some too scared to step forward publicly, painted a pattern. Caldwell had crossed lines before. Yvonne was not the first. She was simply the first to survive long enough to speak. As the investigation grew, so did the media frenzy. National outlets picked up the story, their headlines bolder than the local press had dared. Florida sheriff accused of infecting woman in secret affair. Lawman or predator. Community demands answers. Outside the sheriff's office, protesters gathered with signs. No one above the law and justice for Yvonne. Caldwell tried to weather the storm. He walked into work with his head high, shaking hands, pretending nothing had changed, but the eyes that once looked at him with respect now flickered with doubt. Deputies whispered behind his back. The mayor avoided his calls. At night, alone on his porch with a drink in hand, he could feel it, the slow unraveling of everything he had built. One evening, his wife confronted him. She had stood by him for years, the perfect partner, smiling at church, hosting fundraisers, playing the role of the loyal sheriff's wife. But now her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Tell me it isn't true," she demanded, her voice shaking. "Tell me you didn't risk our lives, our family, for her." Caldwell's silence was answer enough. His wife turned away, whispering, "God help you, Thomas." Meanwhile, Yvonne found herself transformed. The woman who once cowered under his shadow now spoke with fire in her voice. From her hospital bed, she gave her first interview to a local reporter. "I trusted him," she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "He wore the badge. He promised to protect this town. But he didn't protect me. He destroyed me." The article ran with her picture, a pale but defiant woman, her eyes filled with pain and resolve. It spread like wildfire online, shared thousands of times, sparking outrage across the state. For the first time in her life, Yvonne felt seen, not as a victim of gossip, not as a woman discarded by a powerful man, but as someone who dared to tell the truth. Detective Lopez called her later that night. "You just shifted the case," she said. "He's cornered now. No badge can protect him from what's coming." But Yvonne knew the fight wasn't over. Caldwell still had allies, still had the power to manipulate the story. And men like him didn't go down without a fight. As she hung up the phone, she looked out the hospital window at the Florida night sky. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a fragile smile. She had once entered the sheriff's world searching for love. Now she was tearing that world apart, piece by piece, truth by truth. And the more Caldwell fought to bury her, the more she would rise. The courthouse in Gulf County had never seen such a crowd. By dawn, the steps were lined with reporters, locals clutching homemade signs, and deputies trying to keep order. Some shouted for justice, others for loyalty to the sheriff they had trusted for decades. The air buzzed with tension. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. Inside, the wood-paneled courtroom was packed shoulder to shoulder. Every seat filled. Every eye fixed on the defense table where Sheriff Thomas Caldwell sat, stripped his badge, but still trying to wear the mask of authority. His jaw was set, his uniform replaced by a dark suit that did nothing to hide the cracks in his composure. At the prosecution's table sat Assistant State Attorney Karen Stokes, sharp-featured and unflinching. She had built her career on tearing down men who thought they were untouchable, and Caldwell was no exception. Beside her, Detective Maria Lopez flipped through her notes, her face hard as stone. Then the room shifted. The double doors at the back opened, and Yvonne Harris stepped inside. She was thinner than when she had first fallen under Caldwell's spell, her body still healing from the infection that nearly killed her, but there was fire in her eyes. She walked slowly to the witness stand, every step a declaration that she would not be silenced. When she sat, the bailiff raised his hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Yvonne's voice was steady. "I do." Stokes approached, her heels echoing against the polished floor. She smiled gently at Yvonne, her voice calm but firm. "Ms. Harris, Can you tell the jury how you came to know Thomas Caldwell? Yvonne's gaze flicked briefly toward the defense table before settling on the jury. She began to speak. Her words painted the picture of their first meeting, the charm, the promises, the passion. But as she went on, her voice sharpened, each sentence cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "He made me believe I mattered," she said, her hands gripping the edges of the witness box. "But it wasn't love. It was power. He knew what he carried inside him. He knew, and he let it consume me." The courtroom was silent, save for the scratching of pens and the hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Stokes leaned closer. "What happened the last time you were with him, Miss Harris?" Yvonne's voice trembled as she recounted that night. The bourbon, the cruelty, the sour smell, the pain that followed. And finally, the horror of the morning after. "I woke up and felt something wrong," she whispered. "And when I looked, I saw them. Maggots. Crawling out of me." A collective gasp swept through the room. Jurors shifted in their seats, their faces pale. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. And what did the sheriff do? Stokes pressed. Yvonne's eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice rose with fury. "He walked away. He told me never to call him again. He left me to die." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the judge's gavel tapping lightly couldn't break the weight of her words. When it was Caldwell's attorney's turn, the tone shifted. A slick defense lawyer in a gray suit stood and adjusted his tie. "Ms. Harris," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you pursued the sheriff? That you knew exactly what you were getting into?" Yvonne met his gaze without flinching. "I pursued love. I didn't pursue death." The lawyer smirked, pacing. "But you consented. Every time you said yes." Her voice cracked, but her words rang like thunder. "I said yes to a man I trusted. I didn't say yes to being poisoned." The jury leaned in, their faces grim. The defense lawyer faltered, his argument crumbling under the weight of her truth. Finally, Caldwell himself took the stand. He walked slowly, shoulders squared, his eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to see him as weak. He spoke with the same booming authority he had used at press briefings. "I never force her," he declared. "She wanted me as much as I wanted her. This is nothing but lies meant to destroy my name." But under cross-examination, Stokes eviscerated him. "Sheriff Caldwell," she said, holding up a stack of medical records, "these reports show you were aware of your condition for months. Isn't it true that you ignored treatment? That you continued your affairs knowing you could infect others?" Caldwell's face flushed red. He stammered, his confident facade cracking. I didn't think it was serious." "You didn't think?" Stokes snapped, her voice echoing through the room. "You gambled with her life. And when the infection took hold, when she was crawling with decay, you turned your back and walked away." The words landed like a hammer. Caldwell's had dropped, his silence louder than any denial. By the time the closing arguments came, the verdict already felt written in the air. Stokes delivered hers with fire. No badge, no title. No uniform puts a man above the law. Thomas Caldwell was sworn to protect. Instead, he destroyed. Today, you have a chance to tell him, and this entire town, that justice is not a privilege for the powerful. It belongs to everyone, even the least of us. When the jury filed out, the room buzzed with anticipation. Yvonne sat clutching her hands together, tears streaking her cheeks, whispering a silent prayer. Hours later, when the foreman stood and read the verdict, the entire courtroom held its breath. Guilty. The word rang out like a church bell. Yvonne's shoulders shook with relief. Caldwell's face collapsed, his mask finally shattered. Deputies stepped forward, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. For the first time in years, the sheriff wasn't a man in charge. He was just another criminal, led away in chains. The sound of the gavel still echoed in Yvonne's mind hours after the jury pronounced Caldwell guilty. She could still see the sheriff's face, red, broken, his jaw trembling as deputies snapped the cuffs around his wrists. For years, he had towered above everyone, the untouchable man with a badge. Now, in chains, he was just another predator exposed by the light. News outlets swarmed the courthouse steps. their cameras capturing every angle of Caldwell being led away. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes popped like fireworks, and the story raced across the nation before nightfall. Florida sheriff found guilty of endangering woman in secret affair. Badge of shame, Caldwell faces prison. In the swirl of headlines, Yvonne walked out of the courthouse quietly, clutching a small cross necklace her mother had given her years ago. She didn't give a speech. She didn't smile for the cameras. She simply inhaled the Florida air and let the sun touch her skin, warm and steady, as if reminding her she was still alive. But survival didn't erase the scars. At night, when she closed her eyes, she still felt the weight of that morning. The crawling horror, the betrayal, the sound of his voice telling her never to call again. Healing would be slow. It would take more than a verdict. Still, justice had given her something powerful, the chance to begin again. For Caldwell, there was no beginning left. His world collapsed overnight. The uniform that once gave him authority now branded him a fraud. His wife filed for divorce, leaving papers unsigned on the kitchen table of their home before she vanished to stay with family out of state. His deputies, the same men who once saluted him, now avoided his gaze as they escorted him into a transport van headed for a state prison. Inside, the sheriff quickly learned that the respect of a small Florida town meant nothing behind bars. Inmates greeted him not with deference but with laughter, some spitting at his shoes as he passed. For a man who once commanded a county, prison was the final humiliation. Caldwell's first months in prison were a descent into a different kind of hell, one he could not control, negotiate, or silence. The walls were gray and unyielding, but it wasn't the concrete that broke him. It was the way every man who had once feared his badge now studied him like prey. The guards who escorted him down the corridors used to salute him in the courthouse hallways. Now, their smirks followed him like shadows. One guard whispered, loud enough for Caldwell to hear, "Sheriff's the law no more. He's just another number." The word stung more than the shackles biting into his wrists. Letters from the outside world dwindled until they stopped altogether. His wife filed for divorce. His son ignored his calls. Caldwell began to write letters anyway. Pleas for forgiveness, desperate attempts to explain himself. But envelopes came back stamped return to sender. Each rejection was a nail in the coffin of the man he used to be. In the yard, inmates circled him with mocking eyes. Some jeered, "Hey, lawman, still think you're untouchable?" Others spat on the ground at his feet, laughing at the fall of the once mighty. Caldwell kept his head down, trying to project indifference, but at night, in the silence of his cell, his hands trembled. The truth gnawed at him. He had traded respect for lust, authority for destruction. Sleep never came easily. When it did, it brought nightmares. Yvonne's face pale and broken, her screams in the bathroom, her voice echoing in the courtroom. "He left me to die?" Caldwell woke drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, only to find himself in the same four walls, condemned not by a jury this time, but by his own memory. His body began to break down too. Years of drinking and neglect caught up with him. A persistent cough rattled his ribs. His back ached from the steel cot. No one cared. The same man who once commanded ambulances with a single call now had to beg for aspirin. Somewhere deep inside, Caldwell clung to anger. He told himself Yvonne had ruined him, that the town had turned its back unfairly. But in the rare quiet moments, when rage gave way to silence, he admitted the truth he had tried to bury. It wasn't Yvonne who destroyed him. It wasn't the press, the mayor, or the jurors. It was himself. And so, day after day, the sheriff who had once walked tall through his county now shuffled in line for meals, another inmate stripped of power. His name would never again command respect. It would only be remembered with disgust. For Yvonne, those same months were the beginning of something fragile but new. While Caldwell shrank inside prison walls, she grew outside them. His silence became her freedom. His downfall became her proof that no man, no matter how powerful, could crush the truth forever. Meanwhile, Yvonne became something she had never imagined, a voice. Advocacy groups reached out, asking her to speak about abuse of power, about women silenced by men in authority. At first she hesitated. Her wounds were still raw. But when she stood before a room of women at a community center weeks later, her voice cracked only once. "I thought love would save me," she said. "Instead, it almost killed me. But truth saved me. Speaking it out loud, even when no one wanted to hear it. That's what set me free." The women rose in applause, not for a polished speech, but for the raw honesty of a survivor who refused to stay quiet. Detective Lopez, who had stood beside her through every grueling interview and every headline, stopped by the hospital one last time before Yvonne was discharged. She placed a hand on Yvonne's shoulder. "You did more than bring him down," Lopez said softly. "You reminded this town that even the powerful can fall. That matters." Yvonne nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I just want to live again. Not as his victim, but as me." And she did. Weeks later, she returned to her small duplex, its faded yellow paint peeling under the sun. For the first time, the walls didn't feel like a cage. She opened the blinds wide, letting the light pour in. The scars were still there, on her body and her memories, but they no longer defined her. One evening, she walked barefoot into her tiny yard, the grass cool beneath her feet. She tilted her head back to the sky, the Florida sunset painting the horizon in gold and crimson. For the first time in months, she smiled, a small, fragile thing, but real. The sheriff had thought he could bury his sins in secrecy. He had thought his badge would shield him forever. But truth, like the Florida sun, has a way of breaking through. And Yvonne Harris, once silenced, now carried that truth within her, not as a burden, but as a torch. In the weeks that followed the trial, the story of Sheriff Thomas Caldwell traveled far beyond the borders of Gulf County. News anchors in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago replayed clips of him being led away in handcuffs. The once proud sheriff reduced to a disgraced figure. But while the world consumed the scandal in 30-second sound bites, the real aftermath unfolded quietly, both behind prison walls and inside Yvonne Harris's fragile new life. Caldwell entered the state penitentiary under heavy escort, his face pale but defiant. He tried to hold his shoulders back, to carry himself like the lawman he had been. But inmates don't bow to badges. They spit on them. His reputation preceded him, whispered in cell blocks and cafeterias. The sheriff who infected women, the man who hid behind his power until the mask cracked. The first night, a group of prisoners surrounded him in the yard, mocking the way he once strutted through their county courthouse. One leaned in close, sneering, "How's it feel, Sheriff? You protected everyone but yourself." Caldwell said nothing, staring straight ahead, but when he returned to his cell, his hand shook so badly he could barely lace his boots. Days turned into weeks, and the humiliation deepened. Guards who once worked under his command now watched him with cold amusement. Letters from his wife came back unopened. Even his grown son stopped visiting. For the first time in his life, Caldwell had no power, no shield, just silence and 4 concrete walls. Yvonne, meanwhile, was learning how to breathe again. She moved out of her yellow duplex and into a small upstairs apartment closer to the ocean. At night, she opened the windows, letting the salt air wash through the rooms like a baptism. She joined a support group for survivors of abuse, sitting in a circle with women whose stories mirrored her own in painful ways. For weeks, she barely spoke, listening instead. But one evening, when a young woman with trembling hands whispered, "I don't think anyone will believe me," Yvonne finally found her voice. "They'll believe you," she said softly. "And if they don't, you speak anyway. Because your truth doesn't depend on their ears. It depends on your courage." The room fell silent, then filled with nods and quiet tears. Yvonne realized then that her survival meant more than her own healing. It meant being a mirror for others who had been silenced. She also returned to work part-time at the diner, though everything felt different now. The regulars treated her with a mixture of sympathy and awe, as though she were both fragile and unbreakable. Some whispered behind menus, but Yvonne held her head high. She had faced worse than whispers. One evening, after her shift, she walked down to the beach. The sunset bled orange and purple across the horizon. She dug her toes into the sand and let the tide creep over her ankles. For months, she had lived under the weight of death, betrayal, and public scrutiny. Now, for the first time, she felt something else. Peace. Behind bars, Caldwell struggled with the opposite. The days dragged, filled with mocking voices and restless nights. He spent hours staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying Yvonne's testimony in his mind, her voice echoing, "He left me to die." For a man who had built his entire life on control, the memory was unbearable. In the stillness of his cell, he was forced to face what he had done, with no badge to silence the truth. For Yvonne, the future was still uncertain. The infection had left scars on her body and her spirit. Some nights, she still woke gasping, feeling phantom crawling where none existed. But each morning, when she opened her blinds and let the sunlight in, she reminded herself that survival was victory enough. One day at the support group, she spoke words she hadn't dared before. "I am not his victim anymore. I am my own survivor." The room erupted in applause. Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled, a smile that carried not fragility but strength. The sheriff's legacy ended in ruin, but Yvonne's story became something larger than tragedy. It became testimony, proof that even the darkest secrets can be dragged into the light, and that even the deepest wounds can heal one fragile sunrise at a time.